Elizabeth Sidi-ropoulos, CEO of the South African Institute of International Affairs, joins us now. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time. So we've heard our Deputy President say two things, obviously reaffirming that South Africa is all for mediation, but also thanking Russia for opening up a space for mediation and essentially saying that NATO provoked Russia's actions. Is he correct? Must NATO answer for any eastward expansion? Have they broken promises?
So I think certainly the narrative that President Putin has put out there in terms of why he decided on his special operation was about NATO's eastward expansion. That was not the only reason he put out. He also spoke about the fact that Ukraine actually should not have a right to exist, that basically Ukraine and Russia are one nation, one country. He made a number of points about history in his essay of July 2021. Some of these points were repeated again on the 21st of February. He then talked about denazification as another reason for the intervention. He spoke about the genocide happening in East Donbass. So there were many reasons that he put out there for why he was undertaking this. I think it's important to note that when we talk about history, there are always many sides to the story, and there are probably, to each side of the story, there are probably kernels of truth. Did Russia see the eastward expansion of NATO as a provocation? Yes, it did. And I think it wasn't happy with the fact that NATO moved into expanded, by the way, on the request of those countries, into the former Warsaw Pact countries, but not the former Soviet Union, with the exception of the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And I think he was clearly seeing the potential for Ukraine to join NATO, and I have to say it was potential. In 2008, the decision was taken that Ukraine and Georgia would be allowed to join NATO. But like with the European Union, there is a long process that leads to your being to joining NATO. At this point, Ukraine was not a member of NATO. NATO had not placed any forces in Ukraine, nor did it have any missiles or nuclear weapons or anything like that in Ukraine. In retrospect, there's a long history to how the Soviet Union fell in the debate, the discussions in the early 1990s between the Americans and initially the Soviet Union, then the Russian Federation, about what they called the Partnership for Peace, which was supposed to be a very inclusive forum of all the states of the former Warsaw Pact. So all of the former Soviet states, as well as the East European states. That was the idea that was touted by then President Bush Sr. He didn't win re-election in 1992. Clinton came to power, and things developed also in Russia. And yes, the decision was taken not to proceed with the partnership, but to then be selective about who wanted to join NATO and who could join.
Can any of that justify what Russia is doing? No,
absolutely not. Whether you think of the UN Charter, and Russia being a permanent member of the Security Council, or indeed if you think of the Budapest Memorandum that Russia, together with the US, together with the UK, signed in 1994, guaranteeing the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. The agreement was made because after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was real concern about nuclear proliferation. When Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan became independent, there were nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union still on their territories. Both the Americans and the Russians were preferred for there to be less proliferation than more proliferation. And the agreement saw the nuclear weapons that were on Ukrainian territory handed over to the Russian Federation as the successor state to the Soviet Union. To do that, Russia and the US and the UK guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine. The first incursion against that, of course, happened in 2014, and then we have the invasion of last month.
Yeah. So I want to bring it back to South Africa, because our president, our country has abstained. We abstained from that UN resolution. Our president says, no, we favour mediation. We know that there was one announcement from the Department of International Relations that called on Russia to withdraw, but that was basically overwritten by our government's stance on things. And today we've got David Mabuza basically blaming NATO, thanking Russia for opening up a space for dialogue. I want to ask you, are we taking a really neutral position? And if we are, is it justified, bearing in mind the decision coming from the International Court of Justice today and what the rest of the world in many cases is saying?
Taking a position that enables mediation doesn't mean that you can't call out the party that has actually violated the UN Charter. And indeed, as I said, an agreement that it was party to in 1994. It doesn't mean we can't do that. I think mediation, diplomacy is always the preferred route. But we're talking about, and it's interesting to hear that, Deputy President Mabuza talks about NATO as being the root cause. I mean, there are many issues that one needs to understand in the relationship also between the Ukraine and Russia, which goes back in time. It doesn't just go back to the NATO expansion. But to actually place both countries on sort of the same moral platform when one country has been invaded is to me quite an interesting way of seeing it. We can be neutral in the sense that we say, we can say, look, we're not going to speak only to the one side. We want to speak to both sides. That's what being a mediator means. We want to understand where both sides are coming from. We are happy to offer our services in any way we can, because I don't think it's only about us. I think we need to bring together a number of countries, and we've already seen the Turkish government playing a role, the Israelis, and so on. I think there are a number of actors who can help to bring peace at this point, or at least a cessation of hostilities. But to not actually call this out and say, this was an invasion, this was a violation of the UN Charter. And yes, absolutely, the Americans have done something similar in Iraq. I think that's a point, and absolutely, and we condemned that. But we should therefore also not see this in a different light by saying, well, NATO shouldn't have expanded eastward, so Putin was within his right to lose his temper and to say, enough and no further. I don't quite think that that's the way we should be sort of rationalizing what has happened over the last month.
All right, thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. Elizabeth Sidi-ropoulos, she's the CEO of the South African Institute of International Affairs.